It's time for a pop quiz. I know, nobody told you there'd be a quiz, but today there is a quiz. Suffering, is it A, mental, B, physical, C, emotional, D, spiritual, or E, all of the above? Hi, it's Margaret Meloni, and welcome to the Death Dhamma podcast. I'm a Buddhist practitioner out here in the world, having experienced the loss of my loved ones and knowing how much my Buddhist practice helped me on my grief journey. And now, together, we have this safe space to discuss death, dying, grief, and the Buddhist teachings that help us really understand attachment, impermanence, being compassionate, being death ready, what it means to live a life so that we can have a peaceful death. Yep, it's a big topic, and we're going to take it on together. Let's go. If you chose all of the above, or you refused to answer my question, or you answered any of the replies, you're correct. How can that be? Because suffering comes in many forms, and it's many things, and it's different to each of us based on our experiences. And that's why today I thought we'd take some time and review some of the ways in which suffering has been described this season on the Death Dhamma podcast. As you know, as I've had some time to interview various people who are out there in the world helping us with our suffering, most of the times I will ask them to describe or define the truth of suffering. And you'd think everybody would just come back with a standard, suffering is clinging and aversion. And that means that, we want certain things and we don't want other things. And that's the root of all suffering. And yes, I do believe that is the root of all suffering. But we still see it and express it in different ways. That clinging and aversion surfaces in different ways. And so today we're going to look at some of those descriptions of suffering. Suffering is inescapable. I think that is true, at least at first for most of us. But one of our guests basically said that when things hurt, what we try to do is get away. We try and escape. We want to avoid it. So we use that great human invention, denial, to get suffering out of our lives. And that in itself is our suffering. Because if you look at the way you suffer, the way we struggle, you see it never happens. There's no escape. And when you start to embrace it, you realize this is life. This is what I'm dealing with. And if I'm going to achieve anything, I need to learn to embrace it. So there you go. Yeah, for most of us, I'm not enlightened, and so I'm not in a place where I've had experienced a release from all suffering. Maybe you have, in which case you should be doing this podcast, not listening to me, unless it's amusing to you. I don't know. But so, yeah, it is inescapable. And if we try to deny it, it's not going to help. It's just going to make it worse. Suffering lets us know when something is out of alignment. It is like a compass. If we are on a highway or trying to get on the highway, and the highway is joy and fulfillment, it's suffering that lets us know that we're not quite getting onto the highway. It's like the guardrails of life. Joy and fulfillment are the highway, and there's a bit of difference between pain and suffering because pain is part of that guardrail. Suffering is when we're attached to driving and you keep scraping into that guardrail, and rather than being willing to course correct, to straighten out, to drive in the center of the road or away from the guardrail, you keep scraping the guardrail and you're causing yourself more pain and more suffering. That is a description. And so let's look at that for a second. So basically, suffering is helping us see where we need to pay more attention. If we stick with that analogy of suffering because we keep scraping against that guardrail, I could almost bring that to what is it I keep hanging on to? Why am I unwilling to steer away from that guardrail? What is it that I keep bumping into that's really causing me pain? That's attachment, right? And what is it I'm afraid of that makes me keep choosing the same path that keeps bringing me suffering. And that could be a kind of aversion, right? Now, someone else who came to us and had some Buddhism and some psychotherapy translated suffering more like stress. And that was interesting because some Buddhist scholars, monks and scholars, will translate the word dukkha into either distress or disease, or to stress or disease or dissatisfaction with life. And so this person was saying, seeing it from a clinging perspective, it's often about clinging to things that you want and you want them to last longer, and things that you don't want and wanting them to, go away as quickly as possible. She also, again, because this guest came from a background in psychotherapy, talked about it in terms of trauma. There's different kinds of trauma. There's trauma with a small t, and there's trauma with a capital T, which would be abuse and murder and, really big things, the big type of things that we know to be impactful. But the little things every single day that are traumatic to us, they have a big emotional impact, and that's a buildup, and that becomes suffering. Another concept that was introduced was that of spiritual distress. It's a term used in hospital chaplaincy, and it's basically feeling disconnected from ourselves or others who we believe are meant to be close to us, disconnected from ourselves, our community, our friends, our family, or that which is transcendent. If you come from a Judeo-Christian background, that might be God. For some people, it might be the universe. But any sort of break that is coming up away from that spiritual connection, not feeling in touch, that is a form of suffering. This case, in this description, suffering is anything that causes a break between an aspect of our spiritual selves. People can go through difficult things and not experience that break, and then that's adversity. But if somebody becomes disconnected from the spiritual aspects of their lives, of themselves, I'm going to use a phrase that grounds them, then that is suffering. Another idea has to do with the way in which we assume that suffering and not suffering have to exist separately. And the way that this person explained this to us was like this. So we have this concept of no mud, no lotus, right? And so many of you have seen it. It's a popular t-shirt. It's a popular poster. It's a popular phrase. No mud, no lotus. But that means that we're seeing those two things as separate. I'm going through the mud and I'm going to get to the lotus, right? I have to go through the mud to get to the lotus. And then when I'm with the lotus, there's going to be this really pleasant abiding with this beautiful lotus. It's got color and it's blooming and it's got a wonderful fragrance. And so we're not going to remember the mud. We don't see the mud, but the mud is still there. We have the lotus because of the mud, and the mud is there at the same time that the lotus blooms. We just see the lotus because it grows a little bit above the mud. And so we have these things together. They're not separate. The cessation of suffering exists because we have understood this. It's not about getting rid of the mud. It's about recognizing the mud as part of the entire process. For another guest, suffering was truly intense physical pain. 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, physical pain that would not stop, which led him to really pray, please, 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 let this stop. Let me find a way. And then when I find that way, let me be dedicated to help others find their relief from physical suffering as well. We were introduced to a quote from Eckhart Tolle. I'm going to paraphrase that went something like this. Suffering is until you realize that suffering is not necessary. Which meant that for this individual, there had been suffering. It doesn't mean that there wasn't pain or, emotional hurt that came from other people, but that continuing to relive that and dwell on it was continuing to keep the suffering alive. That understanding that difficult things will happen and you will be hurt, but you can find a way to step in and put an end to revisiting it, reliving it, and carrying it with you, and therefore re-traumatizing yourself. When it comes to addiction, it's the lack of control, and it's so important for people maybe who haven't experienced addiction or been around it to understand that people who are suffering from addiction, drugs, alcohol especially, are not just stuck because they like to party. They are physically, emotionally addicted, and it is a struggle. And that struggle is a suffering because there's that lack of control, because eventually that addiction owns you. That addiction owns you. The way it was said was, like one day maybe you look and you find out that you're robbing someone and you never thought you were that person. So you have this experience where you're looking and you're seeing that you're the person and you're holding the gun, and that's your addiction overpowering you into that downward spiral, and you lose control. And there you are on the street asking for change, and you are just really about what is my next fix, and that is owning you. And it's like you're a slave and you've lost that ability to control your addiction. And that's when you look at yourself and find out that you're a person who might hold up others or steal money, and that is absolutely suffering for yourself and the others around you. After all this, there is the acknowledgement that sometimes suffering isn't easy to put into words, that words maybe aren't going to do it justice, that we can't find a way to describe or meet that feeling when we verbalize it. It's an experience, it's intense, it's difficult, and the best thing that we can do when possible is to hold it and understand it, to just be witness to our own suffering, and then one day maybe to be able to witness the suffering in others, and to understand in ourselves and in others that suffering doesn't make us broken, and that we don't need to be fixed, and we don't need to be judged. But we don't want to pretend that it's not there and that it's not happening. So it is definitely about being able to be with it in a way, because after all, suffering goes hand in hand with impermanence. So is suffering mental or physical or emotional or all of the above? The answer is yes. Suffering is. I think the answer is suffering is. And suffering is absolutely because of clinging and attachment. We want some things, we don't want other things. And there is a way out of suffering, and that way is to live by the Eightfold Noble Path. And suffering is human, and it is part of who we are. It's part of our experience. Not to be shamed, just to know suffering is. I've got books for you, starting with Carpooling with Death, How Living with Death Will Make You Stronger, Wiser, and Fearless, the book that got me going and helped me to discuss going through the death of my loved ones, followed by Sitting with Death, Buddhist insights to help you face your fears and live a peaceful life, based on Season 1 of the Death Dhamma podcast, and just recently, Enlightenment Unleashed, how your pet can lead you to spiritual transformation, because during our lifetime, we may see the rising and ceasing of many pets, and we love them like they are our family. Find these on Amazon.com or come see me at MargaretMeloni.com. You've been listening to the Death Dhamma podcast with your host, Margaret Meloni. Thank you so much for being here. Come find me on MargaretMeloni.com, MargaretMeloni.com. And until we meet again, may you be well, may you be happy, may you be at ease, and may you be free from suffering. Bye for now.